Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Selhorn, and welcome to another episode of Speak Easy, the podcast where we discuss communication, capturing our thoughts, and how we share those thoughts with our future selves and others. We believe that managing our brains is core to 21st century work, and we're here to learn how to do it better than we did yesterday. Thanks so much for listening. Speak Easy is brought to you by Cleft. With our cross platform applications, you can simply speak your mind, and Cleft will collect your thoughts. Cleft enables you to process verbally wherever you are and send your best bits later. Today, we are blessed to be learning out loud with Janine VanStee. Janine has an inspiring story. From a young age, Janine felt a deep desire to make a real difference in people's lives. This led her to explore several different paths, including teaching, psychology, nursing, and medicine. Ultimately, she found her calling in special education. For 30 years, Janine dedicated her career to supporting students with a wide range of disabilities, working her way up from teacher to central office administrator. Interestingly, it wasn't until the age of 50 that Janine discovered for herself that she had been living with ADHD. This personal revelation provided a deeper understanding of her own challenges and, perhaps even more importantly, amplified her empathy for the students she served. Her career in education drew to a close, the desire to continue making a difference remained strong. That's when she discovered ADHD life coaching. It was a perfect fit. Now, as an ADHD life coach, Janine brings a wealth of experience from special education combined with a uniquely personal understanding of ADHD. To help others navigate the complexities of their own experiences, she is passionate about working one-on-one with individuals, helping them develop effective strategies, build self-awareness, and create a lasting positive change. Together, she explores strengths with her clients, overcome obstacles, and set achievable goals that truly align with each individual's values. Janine, thank you for allowing us to capture your thoughts here today. I'm curious, what was the journey that helped you come to discover that you yourself were struggling with ADHD such a late age?
Yeah, well, it's actually a sort of common story in a way, in the fact that I had done a great job my whole life masking and doing all of the strategies and coping mechanisms and really had gotten through. Um, Always felt like I was working harder than everybody else, though, and I always felt like I was just a step behind. And but I just kept going and kept going. And then I hit perimenopause. And I said, "Oh, this is crazy." So then all of my coping strategies and mechanisms stopped working. And here I am in a central office position for the first time in my life. And my brain is going a million directions and my focus is completely gone. I used to call it the rotation, where I would sit at my desk and I would do something to the left. I would do something on my computer. I'd do something on the right. And I just keep kind of rotating through them because I had so much going on and I didn't have the ability to get it back under control at that moment. And that happens for a lot of women when they hit that stage of their life. A lot of those coping mechanisms stop working. And suddenly we're like, what is going on? I mean, because the way I say it is we've been functioning like we were in menopause our whole lives. We hit menopause and now you get to multiply it by two. So that's kind of what happened, is because we've been functioning with brain fog, with the crazy stuff that goes on in our heads for a long time in different ways. And now we've got this on top of it. I was talking with my psychiatrist who we had a long-term relationship and she knew a lot about me. I had previously been diagnosed with OCD, anxiety, and depression, which is also really common for women because for a long time we weren't diagnosed with ADHD. And then finally one day she looked at me and she said, "Look, I just want you to consider that you may have ADHD." And I'm like, Gosh, it works 30 years identifying ADHD in children. I certainly would be able to identify it myself, right? Wrong. Yeah. So the more we dove in, the more I realized she is so very right. And I do have ADHD. It was a difficult thing for me, especially because I felt a little embarrassed about the fact that, yeah, I've worked with these people all of my life. And yeah, I hadn't identified it myself. But that's one of those things about coaching. You start to be able to see yourself in a different light and see things in a different light. And so when I found out that I had ADHD, I had to change a lot of thought processes because my first place that I went was shame, embarrassment, um, and a little bit of anger too, to be honest, because when you tell somebody, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and I'm shocked, and they look at you and they go, of course you have ADHD. Why didn't anybody mention this before? If
Yeah.
everybody knew I had ADHD. So yeah, that's kind of my story. But really it all started with when those mechanisms stopped working and I couldn't get control of the things that were going on in my head, in my life, in my calendar, and all of those things.
Okay. You mentioned a few different things that exist inside of your mind, right? You were talking about some of the feelings of embarrassment, of shame, of anger, right? You also talked about masking. You talked about your brain was going a million directions. And all of this was related to hormonal changes that were happening and probably like things that were happening in your brain before menopause kind of like brought some of these to the forefront of multiplying by two,
So
right? And I guess maybe I'm curious to learn what were those mechanisms that stopped working for you? You know, you mentioned masking, you mentioned things that you had been managing your ADHD with previously. What were some of those things that you were doing to like control and manage your time and your brain to be able to operate? You'd been a successful, educational administrator, teacher, right? And now those behaviors that had been working weren't continuing to work. Like, what were those things that you were managing all of that with before?
I was managing them with traditional calendar, which oftentimes will work for people with ADHD for a period of time. And so I was using a traditional calendar. And I also always had, and I still always have, a journal or a notebook.
Yeah.
What started happening is I forgot to put things into the calendar. I forgot to put things into the notebook, forgot to look at the notebook. I, was not able, I was double booking myself a lot. My time blindness just went crazy and I would forget to put something in my calendar. Then I would double book, just things like that, or where I couldn't get that focus where I used to be able to get that focus. And I like where I used to be able to put on some music and grab a cup of coffee and off I'd go. Suddenly music and the coffee piggybacked is not cutting it anymore.
Interesting. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really interesting about what we're trying to do here at Cleft, right, is to fill in the gap of that forgetting, right?
Oh,
And have Cleft be so. Full disclosure, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but if this is your first listen to Speak Easy, go back to episode 1. Jonny Cosgrove, one of our founders here at Cleft, he is identified autistic, neuro ADHD person. In fact, check out his episode on Janine's podcast if you're wanting to go deeper with him. But Justin and Jonny are both identified neurodivergent individuals, and we wanted to build something that was for those people that can be. It turns out that computers remember stuff better than people do, especially people like us, right?
yes.
And it's really crucial to have an easy way to have Johnny's phrase is a release valve for his brain. Maybe that speaks to you or a listener or Janine, but I think that's something that for me, I am not identified, but I am somebody who talks too much, right? And needs some help with some executive function, right? So often that we see with ADHD or neurodivergent individuals is, okay, I need to shorten this to something that someone can actually absorb instead of all the words. Keep going with us there, Janine. What am I doing?
You're trying to learn how to bottom line.
Bottom lining. Okay.
Yeah. The most important details go on the bottom line. The
Mhm.
rest of them kind of float around above it. We only stick on the bottom line when we're trying to get our point across in a quick way.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate Cleft helping me to bottom line, especially when it's a moment where maybe the cursor's blinking back at me and it doesn't come out of my fingertips, right? It's very helpful to process verbally and just get back something that I can send in text. I guess maybe I'm curious to learn, okay, now that you are identified and you've come to the other side and you're helping other individuals, what are the mechanisms and behaviors that are helping you and helping your clients today as you are growing and improving?
Well, so a lot of coaching is very individual,
Mm.
but there are a lot of universal truths that we run into when we're coaching. The big things that my clients get out of learning from me and coaching with me is they learn how to do the process of when they run into a roadblock or identify a roadblock, they find out that they have mechanisms in their brains where they can go in and figure out a way around it, over it, or through it. And so what I'm trying to do is teach them to ask the right questions, challenge yourself in the right way, and come up with your own strategies that work for you when you come to those roadblocks. But the first step in that is being able to identify the roadblock in the first place, right? If you
Of
don't
course.
even know it's there, we've got to identify it first. So the universal truths of that is that there is a process to help yourself learn coping strategies and ways of getting around things. And it's a way of changing your thinking. I don't know if
Okay.
that answered your
Well,
question.
I think that's helpful. I hear you rhyming with Johnny actually when you're talking about through it, around it, under it. He uses that kind of phrasing all the time where he is so outcome focused, right? Even like the way that we designed Cleft to be is that we want to design it with accessibility first, right? And when we build for neurodivergence, right, we also build for any other kind of brain, right? Because
Mhm.
if it can adapt to that edge case or that divergent thinking person, it's able to absorb any kind of person's usage, right? And that's really helpful in terms of just how we think about building software. But it's also like helpful in what you're saying is like just identifying roadblocks for yourself and thinking through the process of what it is that we're going to do to be able to get to the outcome that we're seeking. One of the things that I wanted to center in this conversation with us is when you're building processes with clients, when do you introduce like technology? We're both flagging the journals that we're using and during this conversation to each other. And maybe it's as simple as a journal, but like when do you introduce things that are external to our mind in those processes? How do we build the right triggers for when we're going to use a tool like Cleft or any other, like voice memo system or a journal or a calendar or whatever you name it? How do we decide which things go where? Right? Where is the dividing line between, okay, I'm going to manage this inside my own head, right? And here's where I'm going to put this and I'm going to externalize some part of my mind in a tool.
Well, so I remember what I was going to say is which
Yeah.
I truly believe that every person has some sort of executive function issue,
Mhm.
but nobody has a perfect executive functioning system.
Yep.
And so Clef works for anybody who, has issues with this. You don't have to have ADHD. You don't have to have autism. Same thing with coaching. You don't have to have those things to benefit from executive functioning coaching.
I'm curious to learn, like, where is the
Oh,
dividing
when
line
do we
between
start
things that I
talking
should
about
manage in
that?
my own mind and things that I should, like, use a tool to manage?
Okay, so I would say what things should I try to keep in my head? Nothing.
Yeah.
No.
Mm.
To be honest with you, it's difficult for people with ADHD to keep one thing in their head. Sometimes you go to another room and you've forgotten what you were doing. I've had clients who've had to piggyback different pictures in their heads just to get to one room to the other to remember it. Never depend on your brain off completely. Um, and that's not saying that you're not capable, but the additional stress and emotional energy that you have to put into remembering something is so much more detrimental than it is to learn to write it down or speak it aloud or do whatever you have to do. And that's where the individuality comes into. I had a guy who used technology of the yin yang and was not being successful and then figured out he needed paper pencil, right? So it just depends on the person. But I would say it's very difficult to depend on your brain for much of anything. And I don't know if you know anything about research. Eyewitnesses are the worst kind of witnesses there are because they really don't always remember that well. And that's a normal part of the human experience.
Okay, so I'm hearing you kind of like so shout out to the PKM people out there. So okay, PKM, let's personal knowledge management people talk about this idea. Tiago Forte, he is a like kind of a leader in that space, and his idea is to create a second brain, right? Using digital notebooks, right? That's his idea. And I hear you echoing that thought just a little bit when you say, don't keep it in your head, right? Write it down, right? I think that's interesting to hear when we think about how do we do that in terms of identifying that, first of all, I shouldn't keep it in my mind, right? Like we want, how do we overcome that you were mentioning earlier, right? Talking about shame and anger and embarrassment associated with not identifying that for yourself, having worked with those kinds of students, right? But I think maybe one of the things I want to help us to overcome in this conversation is for that listener to say to themselves, it's okay if you didn't remember. In fact, it's great that you even noticed that you didn't remember it. Like, how do we get over ourselves and start leaning on the help that we need?
Well, that's a really good question. I can relate to it really personally. When I first started teaching, I could tell you what lesson I was on with which reading group and what day, and all those things were up in my head. I barely needed a plan book, right? But that's all I was doing was teaching. That was my main focus in my life. I didn't have children. I had a husband, but I was focused on my career. And I couldn't continue to do that as I had more things that came into my life that I needed to focus on because our vessel, our brain fills up and then there's so much going on in there that things get lost. It's the same thing as if you have a nice clean dresser and you always keep your wallet on your dresser, right? And it's worked for years. And then suddenly things have changed in your life. You're busy, you've got kids, you've got a new job, whatever. And your desk becomes very cluttered and you forget that your wallet's even there. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I guess maybe I want to invite us to the moment where we're going to start to conclude, but I'm going to open up this kind of conversation to be kind of comprehensive because I want to invite you to talk about like how you think about communication, how you think about even your own self-talk, how you think about managing your mind. Give us a before picture, before your diagnosis, and then maybe what was it that was inside of your mind during your diagnosis, right? And then what is this post time? And now you're supporting others that are experiencing that same moment in time. How do we talk to others? How do we talk to ourselves in ways that are helpful to us in those different kind of moments in time?
Oh, you are touching a little spot in my heart because I am a big proponent of positive self talk and not negative self talk. And I always have been, even before I was diagnosed, because I taught that to my students. If you hear it in your head, if you hear it out loud, you're still hearing it and you shouldn't be hearing those things. And so as far as that goes, I see a lot of my clients go through a before and after with that negative self talk, and it can be so detrimental. Don't get me wrong. I have negative self talk and I've struggled with negative self talk. But I've always been aware of it, aware that it was there. It wasn't until after my diagnosis, though, and during my diagnosis, I was negative self talk to the extreme, it was stupid. How could you not know this? Now you look ridiculous, all the things. But then after my diagnosis and after going through my coaching training and receiving coaching myself, um, and doing a lot of coaching and all of that stuff, I was able to make a change in my perspective. And now I go by the rule of thumb. If I say something negative or mean to myself, I ask myself, would I say that to a 15-year-old me? No, I never would say that to a 15-year-old me. And I've even talked to a coach who said she has people get a picture of their younger self and look at the picture and say, would I have said that to myself? So, negative self-talk, positive self-talk definitely changed. Even though I was aware of it before, it takes effort, direct and in challenging yourself kind of effort to slow that down. And what I would say is you need to understand why it's so important. And ultimately, what it comes down to is if somebody else tells you you're stupid, you hear it. If you tell yourself that you're stupid, you hear it. Same impact, but maybe a little bit worse from you, right? But sometimes it might be worse from the other person, depending on how your rejection is, but it's still the same impact. So even if you're just saying it to yourself, you're impacting yourself in a negative way. People hear things over and over that are negative, they start to believe them.
Well, I have tears in my eyes thinking of how I would want to speak to my 15-year-old self and how I would speak to my 42-year-old self. I'm a person too, just like that 15-year-old. And I think that as I think about cleft, I do a lot of speaking to myself, right, inside of that space. And I appreciate your invitation to be kind to that person, right? And
Absolutely.
to be respectful of myself to start with, right? And whoever it is that I want to be communicating with, even just if I'm recording a cleft, it's for myself to begin with, right? And then I will decide what I'm going to send on to that other person. Well, okay. Janine, I wanted to just give you a chance to send off with how we can find you, how we can follow you, learn more about you and your ideas. How should we stay up to date with you and what you're up to?
Well, you can find my webpage at jvanstee.adhdlifecoaching.net.
And we
Uh,
will put that in the show notes. We will make sure that you can find it, and you can click right on. If your podcast player supports it, we will have that link for you just right there in the MP3. So get in
and
there.
email is also jvanstee, ADHD at gmail.com.
Fantastic.
And my YouTube channel is Janine VanStee, ADHD Life Coach.
Fantastic. Well, we will be able to find Janine VanStee
I
for
do want to
sure.
plug my Eavesdrop too,
Please
my
do.
podcast. So I also have my podcast that you can find on all the major providers. And it's called ADHD Eavesdrop. We had Jonny on just a little while ago. And yeah, so I just wanted to plug that as well.
Fantastic. Janine, it was awesome to be together today. Thank you for allowing us to collect your thoughts. Blessings.
Blessings.
Speak Easy is brought to you by Cleft. With our cross-platform applications, you can simply speak your mind and Cleft will collect your thoughts. Cleft enables you to process verbally wherever you are and send your best bits later. Check us out at cleftnotes.com. That's CLEFTNOTES.com.